Hello, I'm David Bohl, yet my original birth certificate reads Baby Boy Bender. That's because I was relinquished at birth by my family and placed with an adopted family 7 days later, and I was renamed David, middle initial B Bohl. So you can see that I cite two events. First, that I was given up. Second, that I was adopted by another family. And for me, it's really important to acknowledge these as two separate and distinct events because they can have different effects across the lifespan, and they absolutely have in mine. I have one sister who sadly passed, but she was born to my adopted parents, and a brother who was adopted from another family altogether. I also have relationships with several genetic relatives, although not my parents, because my first parents had passed before I searched for them. Yet I do know half brothers and sisters, aunts and cousins. I also discovered that I'm part of the MPE, or the misattributed paternal event community, because of a DNA surprise I learned about my genetic grandfather. And of course, I'm part of the search community because I've used DNA to help fill in the blanks of all the missing information I've had since I was relinquished and adopted. In addition to all that, I'm in long-term remission and recovery from alcohol use disorder and from nicotine use disorder. I'm active in the adoption community as well as the recovery community. I've done a significant amount of work personally to investigate some misperceptions that previously informed my life and to fill in those blanks that I mentioned a moment ago. This is morphed into a memoir that I've written titled Parallel Universes, The Story of Rebirth. And I've also collaborated with Dr. Jamie Marich, who's written 13 books on trauma, to write the monograph Relinquishment and Addiction, What Trauma Has to Do with It. You can learn more about those books by either Googling them or visiting them on my webpage, davidbbohl.com. I've been married to the same amazing woman for 40 years. I have two adult children who are enthusiastically in my life, and I currently reside on a lake in the Midwest where I practice Blue Mind. And Blue Mind is where I gain mental and physical health benefits from being near, in, and or on the water. And of course, I work with individuals and families and organizations to help those with addiction and or those with separation experiences. And I'm honored to share my information and my story with you today. Thanks for being here. I am 63 years old today, and I have a fairly good understanding of myself and my life, but that wasn't always true. The story I knew and told myself and others for the first 40 or 45 years of my life wasn't so clear. It went something like this. I was adopted as an infant. After years of applications, interviews, and waiting, my adopted parents got the call, and I was delivered to their home shortly after I was born. I was the first child of Richard and Joan, who were biologically unable to have children of their own. I was welcomed and loved. I had little information from my adopted parents as to my history. My adopted mother told me that my birth mother was a redheaded cheerleader from the University of Wisconsin, that my birth father was a student on the University of Wisconsin football team, but nothing beyond that. I don't recall a time growing up when I didn't know when I was adopted. The fact that I was adopted was talked about often in the home from the very beginning. And the way my parents characterized it was that I was special and chosen. So looking in from the outside, it appeared as though I had lots of opportunity and lots of support. Yet, I remember feeling different from others from a very young age. At the time, my mother described it as being timid and shy, and that may have been partially true, but more truthfully, I felt I didn't fit in anywhere, and I felt that other people knew exactly where they belonged, and I didn't. Further than that, I felt deeply tainted, that something was wrong with me. Now, I never really attributed this to anything, right? I had no vocabulary for that. I had no way to discuss it. I just assumed that's who I was. And I just sometimes felt that I was inadequate because I couldn't overcome these things. No one else seems to be struggling with these things. Why have I been cursed with this? But I got through life. Sometimes I survived, sometimes I thrived. Sometimes I did okay, yet I still felt disconnected. I had a large social circle. I was respected. I was successful in my career endeavors. I was able to build a family. I was able to sustain a relationship. And there was one exception to doing okay. It was when I went away to college and my life almost imploded. But that's a story for another time. Let's just say I struggled to make new healthy connections in a new environment. After college, I got married at age 24. We've had two biological children. My wife suggested immediately that it would be prudent for me to try to obtain some family medical history. Even though I had shown no interest in doing that, didn't mean that it was fair for my children not to have that information available to them. I agreed, and I did a little research and learned that adoption records were sealed in Wisconsin. So that was deterrent for me. I assumed I would never be able to find out, so I gave up. Some years later, when my children were in their teens, I had a second grand mal seizure, and the doctors were not able to diagnose it. My neurologist encouraged me, however, to try to obtain some more information. By the way, this was the first doctor who ever, A, acknowledged my adoption, and B, suggested that it might be an important factor in the present moment. So from this neurologist, I learned that I could petition the state of Wisconsin to obtain non-identifying information from my adoption file. And I did this, and I learned some family medical history. My grandmother died of heart disease. My grandfather had Alzheimer's, but there was nothing that showed that I could be genetically predisposed to seizures. So again, that was the end of my search. It was exhausted, and there was nothing left to pursue. So I went merrily about my business, and I accepted her, so I thought I did, but there's much I would never know about my family history due to these protective adoption laws. But I unwittingly opened the door in the floodgates when I reached out to the state of Wisconsin to obtain my non-identifying information. Because about 9 months after my initial contact, I received a second letter from the state of Wisconsin that said that they had attempted to make contact with my birth mother, but they learned that she had passed away as a result of alcoholism. And stop. Now, the timing of this news was remarkable to me, mainly because as I was living my life and getting married and having children, my use of alcohol was increasing dramatically. And the negative consequences were adding up and impossible to ignore at this stage. I was now holed up alone in my basement office almost every night, isolated, drinking and watching the show Intervention, because, those people had a problem, not me. That wasn't me, right? I also found it curious that the letter stated that she died as a result of quote unquote alcoholism. And that would never be written on a death certificate. Liver failure, maybe, or cardiovascular disease or respiratory failure, maybe. But alcoholism, how did they know that? I wondered. Well, though it took me 9 months from receiving the information about my mother dying of alcoholism to finally acknowledge my own, that did serve as the spark of light for getting sober. And in 2005, I had my last drink, or probably 20 last drinks, to be very honest with you. And I've been in sustained remission and recovery since then, thankfully. And getting sober, stopping drinking, was a catalyst that started me on the very journey that I continue to be on today. That of integrating what I could from my addiction and my relinquishment, my adoption stories into my recovery and my overall life story. That is, converging my family of origin life with my adopted life. Big task. Yet it's been an investigation that allowed me to develop a much more cohesive narrative about my life and my identity, about myself. And here's what I know today. And it's a much more comprehensive narrative than I was able to provide earlier. I was, in fact, relinquished at birth to the state of Wisconsin after my biological mother spent the last 5 months of her pregnancy away from her family in a home for unwed mothers. She was away because my biological father, the man who impregnated her, and she knew this in a way that only a woman can know, which, by the way, DNA has now confirmed, my biological father denied paternity at the time. And because having me out of wedlock would bring shame upon my families, both of them. And my mother was away because that's what her family and my father's family pressed her to do. So while she was away, only her father visited her, and her mother died unexpectedly of a heart attack, causing embarrassment to the family when my mother attended the funeral back home while 6 months pregnant with me. My mother never saw me after she delivered me, yet she hemorrhaged dangerously from the delivery for 3 days thereafter. I was the ward of the state for 7 days, then adopted into a new family, and I was their first child, David B Bohl. Now, I mentioned earlier that I knew I was adopted from the very beginning. I always knew, and that's true. What I've learned since that time is that there's a monumental difference between, on the one hand, knowing that one is adopted, on the other hand, everybody affected by the adoption having open and honest discussions about what that means, and that never happened. Perhaps it was the sign of the times. Perhaps it was some shame left over. Perhaps there were much more learning that needed to be done, but these discussions were not had. And I dealt with it. I lived happily thereafter. Well, I lived. Sometimes I simply survived thereafter. Sometimes I suffered thereafter. Sometimes I was okay thereafter, sometimes I thrived thereafter, but I obviously had some challenges to deal with. And after many years of investigating and processing and finding support, I've gained some clarity about what things looked like, what things in reality really looked like as I was growing up. And here's what I know now. And maybe you can relate to some of these. This is that reframer. These were the misperceptions that I've had to reinvestigate as time went on. And here's what really was going on. Growing up, I always felt like I was different and that I didn't belong. I believed that there was something so obviously wrong with me that I had to keep it hidden from everybody. Or worse, that they could already see there's something wrong with me and I had to try to hide it and be ashamed of it. I struggled with identity and I didn't really know who I was. This is in part because I didn't have any biological markers or information to draw upon about genetic relatives. I suffered from an identity crisis, which is a term coined by the German psychologist Erik Erikson. Erik Erikson was adopted by his stepfather, by the way, where I failed to achieve a healthy ego strength and self-identity during adolescence. I had an identity crisis. I struggled with relational issues like attachment, and I had no idea who to trust or how to trust, including myself. I suffered. I always felt alone, isolated, and misunderstood, and I didn't even have the vocabulary to describe these things, let alone entrust anyone enough to talk about them with them about this. And today I'd referred to this process as developmental interruption and or chronic stress. Then something unexpected and extraordinary happened. At age 13, I inadvertently stumbled upon alcohol as a solution to all of those problems, all those self-doubts. And I felt like with that first drink that I'd found the connection I was so desperately thirsting for. Here I was, separated from reality and relationships, and I developed coping mechanism to avoid the pain, right? Alcohol became my go-to coping mechanism. Now, professionals say that people who experience addiction cease in their personal development the moment they begin using drugs or alcohol in addictive ways. And I can now say that that's likely true. I was likely drinking alcoholically right out of the blocks because alcohol altered my perceptions and changed my reality. But it also interrupted my healthy development. And eventually, after many years, that progressive nature of alcohol addiction almost killed me. And literally, and what was once a miracle solution became nothing more than a way to check out intentionally or unintentionally. Gratefully, I was able to get sober and clear my mind with help, of course, with the assistance of an emergency room detoxification, a residential treatment stay, an intensive outpatient program, and lots of support meetings. These things helped me to stabilize my life. Yet, even then, I continued to feel lost. Well, after I get sober and my life had become more manageable, I still felt there was something wrong with me beyond my alcoholism. Something had to be wrong with me, right? If I was given up for adoption. I had lots of problems trusting people, including theological writers and the folks in those very support groups, as well as the writers of that literature. Well, why did I still feel lost, right? I was healthy. I was making healthy decisions. Why couldn't I trust? Well, the gentleman who helped co-found one of the 12-step fellowships, Bill W., was just like me. He was an alcoholic who had 2 relinquishment or separation experiences. First, when his dad went away to a conference and didn't come home and his parents got divorced. And second, when his mother left home to study to be an osteopath, leaving he and his sister to be raised by grandparents. He had the same experience as I did. Why didn't he talk about that in AA so that I could? Well, I couldn't. Not so much that I wasn't welcome to do so there. I needed to do a lot of work before I could put together a story to tell. So despite this stabilization, despite stopping drinking, despite getting healthier, I needed more. I had to dig deeper and deeper to figure things out. I had to do more than just stay sober. I had to keep questioning my perceptions, and I had to continue to pick up that process of personal development, including learning healthy coping mechanisms for life challenges from where I left off, from where I interrupted them by using drinking as a coping mechanism. And I had to examine how being relinquished and not healthily attaching to my adoptive family were informing my life and the choices I made. So I did this ongoing work to get healthy and to better understand myself, to better and more completely answer that question, who am I? Who am I? I've learned the hard way that I need to keep asking that question. As a relinquishee, as an adoptee, as a person in recovery, I have to ask that question to stay safe and healthy. Who am I? This journey, and the journey I expect to be on for the rest of my life, is about investigating how my experiences and perceptions have combined to define who I am today. Who am I today as a result of what's happened to me? And I have to examine the role of my true self, my identity, and my values, and my psyche, and what that looked like in the past, what it looks like now, and what it could look like. And as I've done this, I've also continued to investigate my biological family where and when I could. I've learned a few things. I've learned that my mother died a terrible alcoholic death in a homeless shelter. She had 5 children with 2 other men after me, one who died as an infant and 4 others. And most of us suffer from addiction and other mental health disorders. I do have relationships with 2 of them, and I've met 3 of them. My father died at the age of 46 of a brain tumor. He had 2 children after me. He had his challenges with alcohol. I've met both of those children. I've also met my father's sisters, who I have relationships with. And I've met my father's wife, who provided to me an immense amount of context and information to help me to learn about my father and thus myself. And I've learned about my biological family and heritage as a result of knowing these people, just mirroring these people. And thus I've learned a lot, again, about my true self. And what I can tell you is that knowing, even though the facts are oftentimes heartbreaking, is infinitely better than not knowing, or wondering, or fantasizing, or worrying, or being told something that isn't true. That proverb, better the devil you know than the devil you don't, is right on the money for me. And yes, the story is not pleasant. There is indeed a long history of alcoholism on both sides of my biological family. There's alcoholism in my adoptive family. And I need to acknowledge that, and I need to incorporate that to my narrative. So that brings us to the present. So far, I've talked a lot about what it was like and what I was like. I talked about what happened to me, and I talked about what I needed to acknowledge. Now let's talk about what it's like today. Well, what it's like today is really simple for me today. My life is good. It's better than I imagined it could ever be. And I don't say that in a boastful way. I say that in an astonished way. I was on a path of self-destruction. How did I become so fortunate to survive that and thrive beyond that? Now, my daily mantra became, at that time, in most ways, my life is ideal. And that still holds true every day today. I'm healthy, physically and emotionally. I have a life partner to whom I've been married for 4 decades. I have 2 adult children with significant others who want me in their lives. I have work that's challenging and rewarding. I have true friends who support me and hold me accountable. I have communities I feel like I truly belong to. I have the peace of mind knowing that whatever happens, I don't need to revert to those old unhealthy coping mechanisms ever again. I've got this. Right? I have a life philosophy that'll sustain me no matter what happens. And believe me, that can be put to the test. It was put to the test not long ago when my adoptive mother passed and I had COVID. I was on an airplane when she passed away. And it will happen again and again as I go through developmental challenges in my life. And those are the ones who surround me. Yet, despite that and everything else, in most ways, my life is ideal. In most ways. So what does my daily life look like? Or what does my program and my philosophy for daily living look like? Well, I don't attend meetings as much as I used to. I do have some very supportive friends who hold me accountable and who support me. Yet I sometimes struggle in those support groups because I'm a relinquishee and I find it difficult to trust humans, and because I'm an adoptee. And some of the concepts are very threatening to my sense of self, like having to say that I'm powerless, or having to deflate my ego, or that having to admit when there's something wrong with me, it's me who's disturbed. Those are really unhealthy concepts for me, and I have to be careful with those. I attend some meetings. I have a good deal of people in my network. I have friends that keep me connected the world over, in Toronto and California, and New York and DC, in Florida and Illinois, and worldwide. I attend some secular conferences at times. I facilitate an addiction and adoption constellation support group that I mentioned earlier. I attend adoption relinquishment, separation from family of origin conferences. Of course, I'm here today sharing with you in hopes that you needn't suffer at the level that I did. And I work a daily program. of growth and wellness and identity expansion. I call it relentlessly pursuing reality. Relentlessly pursuing reality. It's that philosophy I mentioned moments ago, and it guides me no matter what happens. In my daily meditation guide, one of them is the Daily Stoic from Stoic philosophy. It helps me to be more resilient, happier, more virtuous, and more wise. And as a result, I hope it helps me to be a better person. Now, ultimately, I relentlessly pursue reality by focusing on two main things. One, I keep working hard. I take an inventory, I investigate, I experiment, and I take action so that I can better get to know myself. And I open myself up to a select few trusted others. And I ask them to hold me accountable, to check my perceptions, to affirm my reality when I'm in touch with reality. And in the end, recovery and being healthy for me are about knowing who I am while not having to be overly protective of my sense of self. In other words, implementing my philosophy without exhausting myself. And I can't be true to thine own self if I don't know who I am. I continue to develop this approach that leads me to reality, to connect me to that power of reality by asking, what do I know right now? What do I know about myself? Sometimes I have to take tests. I have to reverse engineer myself. I take personality inventories. I ask others for feedback. I continue to pursue information about my genetic heritage and living relatives where I can. And I have to acknowledge that I may never know everything that I would like to know about that heritage. Sometimes I might even get rejected in pursuing it. I have to diligently process and work through any dysfunction in the present day. I have to sometimes call upon accountability partners to do this because I have a history of not being able to do this on my own. And I systematically connect with healthy others in non-shaming ways, inside of and outside of support communities. So I relentlessly pursue reality. I connect meaningful with others. And that's my daily program. And that's what I'm doing here today. I'm connecting. I hope you're connecting with this information. I hope you're connecting with my narrative. I hope it's been useful to you. I appreciate you for your time. davidbbohl.com.